last week on Legally Kidnapped.
Good evening. Our top story this week, an audit reveals that California welfare recipients are living it up on lavish vacations in places like Hawaii, Vegas, and Disney World. Los Angeles County files an appeal of a Ninth Circuit decision that it must pay $58,000 to the lawyer of a couple of parents who were wrongfully accused of child abuse and their names were put on the register. And the governor signs a bill expanding a child welfare database so that workers in Los Angeles can have instant info while doing background checks on potential CPS targets and their family members. In Florida this week, a federal class action lawsuit was filed against the state on behalf of a teenager who was sexually abused while in a juvenile detention facility. The Florida child protective industry looks into a fight between two grown-ups at a daycare. In Orange County, Florida, a 13-year-old girl tries to poison her adoptive family, and a 16-year-old 240-pound kid uses a wrestling move on his foster parent during a fight, taking him down to the concrete floor of the garage. The child protective industry in New York is under fire this week for failing to protect a 4-year-old girl who starved to death while in her mother's care. Workers apparently missed signs and skipped out on visits to the child for months prior to her death, despite an open case on the family. And the system sucks over at children's rights file a request for oversight of the Mississippi child welfare industry. A new study reported in the October issue of Archives of Pediatric and Adolescent Medicine concludes that Child Protective Service investigations are relatively ineffective. The study found that child protective interventions did not achieve the result of decreased risk factors, but did in fact increase the rates of depression in mothers. And of course, Richard Wexler, the executive director of the National Coalition for Child Protection Reform, preaches his usual crap into the matter of a well-intentioned but misguided, overworked, underfunded, poorly trained, and overall dysfunctional system. Another study released by Youth Today suggests that children in juvenile detention facilities across the USA are given antipsychotics instead of counseling to keep them quiet even when there is no signs of mental illness. The U.S. House of Representatives calls upon the Japanese government to address the issue of U.S. citizen children being abducted to Japan in custody disputes. In India this week, the government concocts the first of its kind foster care scheme in that country, and spanking will no longer be tolerated in the Indian educational system. In Australia this week, morale is down for workers in Tasmania thanks to a damning report into the prostitution of a 12-year-old ward of the state. A school cook is accused of violating Australia's child protection laws in place to protect children from sexual abuse after giving a boy a cookie, and a 14-year-old foster kid in the Northern Territories gets 2.5 years in juvenile detention after he threatens his caseworkers with a knife and tries to take their car so he can escape the foster care system and go back home. In Canada, a former Alberta child protection worker faces charges of child porn and inappropriate touching of a 17-year-old boy in his care. A small child clings to life in an Alberta hospital after banging her head in her foster home, and the police have been guarding the place ever since. A social worker from Ontario stands accused of going cuckoo after smoking a joint and committing a bizarre sexual assault and murder attempt against a 60-year-old terminally ill cancer patient. And a court in Ottawa overturns the Canadian anti-prostitution laws. It's a busy week in jolly old England as child protective referrals rise by 6% in the UK's 2009-10 fiscal year. Professor Eileen Munro sets out her initial analysis of the child protection system, claiming that processes and procedures keep workers at their desks doing paperwork instead of out in the field spending time with families who are at risk. And 95% of social workers surveyed said that due to ever-increasing job pressures and workloads, decisions about children are made without sufficient information, putting them at risk. Child protective boss Jim Gamble quits over plans by ministers to make the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Center part of the new National Crime Agency. And a new survey reveals that parents of the UK are less concerned with their children's drinking and drugging and underage sex these days than they had been in the past. In this week's foster crimes report, investigations continue into the case of a 26-day-old baby that died in a foster home in Fresno County, California back on September 20th. And the police are investigating the death of a 3-month-old foster child in Florida. In Wyoming, a lawyer gets disbarred from practice for the 2004 conviction of the rape of her foster son back in the 1970s, and foster parents from Polk County, Florida are convicted of stealing money from a $400,000 life insurance policy that was left to their 14-year-old foster son by his mother before she died. In Texas, a 60-year-old foster dad is sentenced to life in prison for molesting his foster children, and in Illinois, a 48-year-old foster father is sentenced to 40 years for molesting and impregnating his. The New Hampshire child protective industry snatches a newborn right from the hospital after accusing her father of belonging to a political group known as the Oath Keepers. And the Nobel Prize in Medicine goes to the researcher whose work led to the first test tube baby. After incurring $24,000 in legal fees to clear their names, a pair of foster parents from Maine are demanding the resignation of the Commissioner of the Department of Health and Human Services after the wrongful removal of their foster children who they were going to adopt in violations of due process by the caseworkers. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa goes on the Dr. Phil show to glorify foster care. And finally, tonight, a New York woman who is going through a divorce claims that she brought bedbugs home from the Bronx County Family Court building, and that they're crawling all over her. For these stories and all the latest dirt on the child protective industry, visit www.legallykidnapped.com. And until next week, this is Baby LK, over and out.